Good morning. Welcome to the Center for Global Development. I'm Amanda Glassman. I'm the COO here. We're really happy to partner with our friends from TechnoServe on an event about the importance of rigorous evidence and evaluation. We obviously work a lot in this space. We look a lot at what the aid agencies and the multilaterals do in evidence and evaluation, so we're really pleased to partner with you on this event. So I wanted to say something about please engage with us on social media. We have a hashtag, which is CGD Talks. I think you can see it there. Send questions, give feedback, join the conversation. We will feature your online engagement, so if you're extremely clever in your tweeting, just wait. And we will post polls on Twitter throughout the event. So if you want to follow us on @CGDev, you can hear the text of the panel and then the subtext of the Twitter. And now I'll turn it over to Will Warschauer, who's the president and CEO of TechnoServe, to say a few words.
Thank you, Amanda. Welcome, everyone. Real pleasure to be here with you. On behalf of all of us at TechnoServe, I want to thank CGD for hosting us. All of us who work in development are smarter because of the great products and events that you put out all the time. Thank you. Thanks to our panelists. We've got a great lineup for today, and thanks to all of them for taking the time, and to all of you for making time to be here, and everybody on the live stream, wherever you are. I've been doing international development work for going on 30 years now, and for most of that time, people have been saying that we are focusing more on impact evaluation, and we're getting better at impact evaluation. And while I suppose that that's true in part, I think there's still, from where I sit, a real gap between the rhetoric and the reality. Too much of one still. And so I'm really looking forward to today's discussions and the continuation of them that will happen after the meeting, so we can continue to get better at this and sort of close that gap between evidence and action. Thank you.
Excellent.
So are we handing it over to me now?
Yes, you're in charge.
Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Veronica Olazábal. I'm the head of measurement and evaluation at the Rockefeller Foundation. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Perfect. I'm very excited to be starting off our day with a topic that's near and dear to my heart, around long-term evaluation, and I'm here with my wonderful panel. So we're going to get really into some of our approaches and our points of views around this particular topic, but I wanted to take a moment to just let you know what the run of show would be. I was going to ask a couple of different questions from our various different colleagues over here, but I did want to allow time for Q&A, and so start thinking about those questions right now. If we do, we'll do a rapid fire type of 1, 2, 3. We'll go through them, we'll come back, and then we'll close it up. Yes? Yes. Perfect. As you know, just to launch us off with a little bit of who I am and where I come from, I work for an organization that has been around since 1913. We just celebrated our 105th birthday about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And interesting enough, long-term impacts has always been one of our key priorities, as our mission statement has remained unchanged since 1913, and it is to promote the well-being of humanity throughout the world. We do have a new president, as many of you are aware of. His name is Raj Shah, and in our transition from our previous administration, we are putting a reprioritization around longer-term and deeper impact. And so this particular topic is very relevant for us. The 5 areas that we will be focusing on are food, health, power, U.S. jobs, and cities, particularly through our 100 Resilient Cities platform. And one of the things that typically comes to my mind as an evaluator thinking about our way forward is this question of long. And so for today, we are thinking about long in a way that is a little bit arbitrary, but over the life cycle of an implementation. And when we talk about impact and measurement, we're actually specifically thinking about ex post evaluation. And the fact that there's very few of them in the world is the reason why we're here today. So with that said, I'm going to hand it off to our colleague Amanda. And I'm going to start us off with, Amanda, why is long-term impact measurement so important to development?
So first I would say in the big picture, most of what we currently finance is actually not evaluated at all. So notwithstanding, and when I say evaluated, I mean rigorously evaluated, so that we can attribute the effect of the intervention that we're financing to the impact that we wish to see at the end of the day. The collective we, obviously, partner governments, aid agencies, NGOs. And this isn't a problem that's unique to aid by any stretch of the imagination. If you think about the impact evaluation movement in the United States, there was one experiment on health insurance in the 80s, really, that forms a lot of the evidence about what we know today. That was done by the Rand Corporation. Maybe someone is here today from that. But I would also say that the stakes feel very high in the field of aid and in work with low-income countries, because the opportunity cost of doing stuff that doesn't make a difference is huge. So to avoid waste, and it really is waste if we don't have the impact that we expect, we must evaluate. It's an imperative. And I'd say it's not just ex post, it's not just long term, it's the right method to answer the right question, or the question that is posed by policymakers. And maybe that question is, okay, if I'm financing something with aid now, do I expect the government to pick it up? In that case, we really do need to build the evidence for the thing that we'd like to happen afterwards. I think long-term impact, though, is very important to understand. And a lot of even the most rigorous evaluations today are biased towards the short term, just because of the way that we provide financing. Short-term financing, short-term results. So we know, for example, school attendance increases, but what do we know about learning? If we know food cash transfers improve food consumption, but do they affect nutrition? What about investments in the longer term? I think some of the most valuable pieces of evidence have to do, for example, in nutrition, a program of food supplements in Guatemala, for example. Now going back 25 years later, actually I think the aid or Rockefeller was part of that initial investments. We know that that particular food supplement actually contributed to increasing wages in the children that benefited from that program. That's very powerful evidence. So we need to know this, and I think we miss the whole point of our work if we don't have that long-term focus on the end and well-being that we want to see. And finally, when things work, it's not enough just to know yes or no, it worked or not. We need to know why it worked, especially if why it worked matters for it being effective somewhere else. That's the sort of the generalizability issue that plagues us in almost everything that we do. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And Amanda, I wanted to pick up on your note, and you did mention that it was related to how we finance it, but your point around there being a bias towards short-term types of evaluations. And I wanted to ask a question around, how do we then, as a development sector, keep an eye on both the short-term and the long term? And is there an inherent trade-off in focusing too much on the short term? And what does that mean for the long term? And could you talk a little bit about what some of those implications could be?
So, I mean, if you think about, there's a couple of evaluations that have come out that show us actually very clearly what the value added is from focusing on both time frames. So sometimes we'll see after 6 months a great impact. I think probably the most famous, or the one that has been discussed a lot most recently, is the Malawi Zamba trial that was cash transfers to adolescent girls. In the short term, everything looked very good, 6 months, 12 months. But a couple years out, we saw that actually outcomes sort of reverted to these girls who had gone through the program, and it actually had some other knock-on effects that I think were surprising to both the researchers and the implementers in the long term. Not to say that it wasn't beneficial in some respects. It postponed childbearing, it postponed age at first marriage, but it actually affected the quality of the partner that they were able to acquire after the cash transfer was finished. So I guess the point being that these things matter if we care about lifetime opportunities for the people and the communities that we partner for.
Perfect. Perfect. And so the key takeaway from our point of view should be that we should do both.
Yes.
So if we turned over to you, Melissa, what is USAID's point of view on long-term and specifically on post-evaluations?
Thanks, Veronica. In USAID's perspective is obviously that long-term impact is very important. We also think that there are short and medium-term impacts that we are responsible for answering for and for achieving. And so I would only underscore the arguments that we need a broad spectrum of approaches in order to be able to understand the change trajectory that's taking place, and whether or not at the end of the day the results that we have worked to accomplish in a country are sustained by others in that country after we're long gone. Within our evaluation policy, however, evaluations are commissioned by those who are making policy, strategy, or programming decisions. And we think that's as it should be, because that is likely to generate the most use and the most uptake of those evaluation findings. We absolutely are not proponents of evaluations that are done just to check a box or that don't have a real intended use at the end of the day. So there needs to be a specific user and a use for those evaluations. What decision is that going to affect? Because measurement resources, not just evaluation resources, but all measurement resources are finite. They are not infinite. And so it isn't feasible for us necessarily to undertake ex post evaluations of every intervention that takes place, because we actually then wouldn't have funding for interventions. We would just be measuring what had been done. So we have to have a balance. We interestingly do have a number of ex post evaluations that have taken place within USAID. There are 18 between 2011 and 2017 that we have found in our evaluation registry. And there are a couple of very interesting series of them that are being done. And what's surprising to me about these evaluations is that the bulk of our resources are programmed overseas. Therefore, the bulk of our evaluations are commissioned overseas. And so even among these evaluations, this list of 18, about half of them were done individually within missions. And to me, that's, extremely interesting, because usually the incentives are not there for you to evaluate a program where you aren't where that was completed 5-10 years ago in some of these cases, and where you aren't necessarily going to be programming, or you don't have confidence that you would be programming in the next few years. So there is something that's taking place, and it's something that we could explore a little bit more to see what are those cases where ex post evaluation is happening in the field. In general, though, my assumption would be that the incentives for informing broad strategy and broad policy decisions and whether specific outcomes were sustained are in Washington. And so those series of ex post evaluations that are being commissioned in specific technical teams here in headquarters are the ones that I would expect to see the most of.
Great, thank you so much. And then just building on, Melissa, your points, from your point of view, what could be, and the fact that you actually do have some post evaluations, some ex post evaluations. I'm curious about, how those learnings, because I realized that I was very shocked to hear that you had ex post evaluations. Mm-hmm. How do you see those learnings becoming generalizable enough to be able to influence, for example, some of the planning and strategy development that happens here in headquarters? What do you think would need to happen in order to bring those two together?
I think what really needs to happen is looking at the kinds of impetus for some of the broader strategic or policy level discussions, and whether the conversation around those areas is actually on sustainability, and whether that conversation is on the extent to which the systems in the countries in which we work are able to maintain those results on their own without us. I think we need to see some more policy level discussion around what is taking place in country in terms of maintaining results, what is the system they're looking like in order to do that, as opposed to how do we know that what we did was sustainable. And I think if we come at it from that policy impetus, then we're going to be able to then extrapolate sort of the evaluation questions that we could ask. But I don't think that it's very useful in my organization to try to lead with a specific drumbeat for specific methodologies or timing of evaluation, that is not really something that resonates with policymakers. You have to go from another angle, and then we can pick it up on the measurement side with what is the appropriate timing, what is the appropriate methodology to answer those questions.
Great. So that's a really great segue to Will. So Will, TechnoServe is not your usual development sector player. You have a very specific business approach to the way that you do your work. One of the interesting points that I took away from one of our earlier conversations is how you are really aligning your business approach to this particular topic, and in fact was very happy that you brought this topic to today's panel. So let's start off with talking a little bit about what is your approach to ex post evaluations, and why do you think that it's important?
Yeah, thanks, Veronica. TechnoServe, for the last 50 years, has pursued business solutions to poverty based on the idea that if we can help people get into commercially viable relationships that are not based on a subsidy or a free giveaway, that's likely to last over time when we go away at the end of a project. And so we tend to give the clients we work with information, training on business skills, sometimes agronomy, access to finance, and access to markets. And so sort of logic would tell you that if people can take all of that in, they're well positioned to continue on with these activities after we leave. But we found that even after 50 years of doing this, most of our evidence for this was really anecdotal. We really were lacking the better studies and harder data about the long-term impact of our work. And it took me about a year of going around to various foundations to get a grant to measure this. And I think it points to a real structural problem. We are, like most international NGOs, funded on a project cycle. So we have a 3-year project or a 5-year project. And during that project, there tends to be adequate resources for good monitoring and evaluation, a baseline, a midpoint, an endpoint. And we've got pretty good data about what happened during the project. But to look and see if those gains that we can document have persisted 3 years, 5 years, 10 years after the project is really difficult. And it's a structural challenge because there's focus on a project cycle, and it's hard after that. We found a foundation that funded us to go and look. We hired a UK research agency, Triple Line, to go and meet with coffee farmers, small coffee farmers in East Africa that we had worked with 5 years previously. So this had been a Gates Foundation funded effort. It had really good impact data about increased yields, increased prices, and therefore increased incomes, some changes to the supply chain. And the question that the research agency tried to answer was, what happened in the 5 years since we left and stopped having contact with those farmers? And we got the results back last year. We were delighted to see that the vast majority of those farmers continued to use the agronomic best practices that TechnoServe taught them that lead to higher yields. They continue to get higher prices. And indeed, the agency saw a lot of local investment in local coffee processing, which is something that we pushed to increase the quality and therefore the price of the coffee. So it was really encouraging, and we were thrilled to have the study. But we and others, I think, need a lot more of them. All of us who care about international development want to see activities with lasting impact. But it's remarkable how infrequently we measure that. We have a real paucity of data around it. And so I think we need to think about the structural problem of funding during a project cycle and how we can get around that so there can be more resources available for more ex post evaluations.
Got it. And so picking up on your point around resourcing, and I know that we're going to have a conversation right after this one on cost effectiveness. When I think about impact and scale, I think about impact, depth, and changes in the lives of people, and scale, which is essentially to me a cost issue. So even when you look at it from a business point of view, there seems to be a value proposition for why we would want to do ex post evaluations. But I wanted to pick up on your point around the cost effectiveness piece, and how does long-term impact really relate to cost effectiveness? Why do they belong together at this event?
Well, I think that the long-term impact is inextricably linked to how you see cost effectiveness, because your cost effectiveness really depends on your view, typically your projection of how long that impact goes on after a project ends. I read a project evaluation recently that had fantastic cost effectiveness results. And when you looked deeper at what they did, you saw that more than 90% of the benefits that they were counting were projected to happen after the project ended. And less than 10% of the benefits that they counted happened during the life of the project. It's not uncommon, and so you see how heavily the cost effectiveness depends on how long you think those benefits persist. And it is the Wild West out there, because different organizations use different methods to estimate that. And everyone makes their best possible effort looking at literature, looking at similar projects. But the truth is there's not enough data for us to know. We at TechnoServe have historically used, when we do our cost effectiveness calculations, 3 years, we've modeled 3 years of impact after the project ends. We felt that's a conservative estimate, and we've wanted to be conservative. We have this one study I mentioned with the coffee farmers in East Africa that showed impact persisting 5 years after. But what is the right number to use? Neither we nor others know enough about that, I think. And I would add, taking advantage of being on the stage with USAID and the Rockefeller Foundation, that I do think this is an area where organizations like yours can really lead. You're in the position to ask for these more often. You're in the position, I think, to solve some of the structural challenges I mentioned, that there's money during the project cycle but not after, and how do we solve for that? Such that we can have more of this data to base our decisions on in the future.
Great, and I'm going to pick up that point and just give you a quick response from me, and maybe Melissa, you might want to jump in. Something that you said earlier, Will, and not earlier today, but in an earlier conversation, was we have to be thinking about this early. And just like every evaluation, as many of you know from the measurement and evaluation space, if you're not going to plan it in, it's not going to happen, because that's when the resource decision gets made for the most part. But in addition to that, that is also when you determine timelines, and a lot of planning that has to do with, and that would affect, and from my point of view, when you would actually want to do an ex post evaluation. So we at the Rockefeller Foundation are starting to try to get very much ahead of the issue, to be proactively measuring and assessing, because as you mentioned, Amanda, earlier on, it costs money to do this work. And at the end of the day, if we don't generate the types of information that we need to make good decisions, we're basically wasting our resources away. But Melissa, what is your point of view? And what do you think prospectively that USAID might be doing differently, to Will's point around ex post?
Well, I like Will's optimism that we're in a position to influence the infrastructure and the large, structural challenges around these problems. I think there are, as I said earlier, specific policy stimuli that need to be, messages that need to be sent, right? There need to be signals within the sector around the importance of sustainability, around the importance of sustainment of results by actors in countries other than ourselves, other than the aid actors. So the extent to which we are incentivizing that entire mindset, which shapes everything in programming, the design, the choices that are made, the measurement system that is set up, the partnerships that are undertaken, I think it's very important to be setting that tone from the beginning, because it really flows down through everything that's done in programming decisions and implementation, and later on into measurement. So I would say that we can try to send those signals, but we also need help in doing that from others in the aid community, because I like also what you said, Will, it's the Wild West out there, and that's not changing. That's going to become worse if you think that that's a bad thing. There are more and more actors in the development space, and that's a good thing, but that means it's going to be harder to bring them all together and build consensus around strategic decisions, around measurement choices.
Great. And Amanda, just picking up on this, and I know you wanted to weigh in, but also, from your vantage point, what could funders and donors be doing, thinking differently to set us up for success?
So because we're talking about cost effectiveness, I wanted to share, in the medical field, when agencies, governments that are going to pay for medicines decide to use cost effectiveness as a criteria on which to take their decisions, so countries, mostly European, UK, Canada does this, they have something called a reference case, and that's a set of principles, methods, reporting requirements that the funder of the study adopts and that all of the researchers that are conducting these studies alongside the implementers would agree to follow. I think we need a reference case for the measurement of cost effectiveness. If only 5 of the big funders would adopt this, it would be transformative. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation actually has a reference case on the books that they are using because they're actually, I think they've, in the global health field, they fund about half of all cost effectiveness studies, both for specific products or for at-scale interventions. But I think that could be a more generalized approach, and it would help also in the comparison of interventions across things that were funded by different groups. I think a second issue is, I think what you've said, Veronica, is a really important point, which is that you have to conceptualize an evaluation ex ante in order to be able to get to ex post. There are, of course, ways to use administrative data to measure rigorously ex post, and that should be the norm because we don't need to be doing a lot of extra surveys and things like that. But where that's not possible, that kind of thing has to be built in up front. Now, I can imagine for a group like TechnoServe, what would be terrific is a kind of flexible impact fund that would allow them to, okay, they're going to take their project money from USAID or others, but that they could come back with this impact fund later and they'll have a good design in place and they can follow up both the participants and the controls in 5 years, in 10 years. That would be incredibly powerful. And I think results like that really speak for themselves. Hopefully it would generate a very virtuous cycle of impact.
And let me pick up on that because when we tend to think about evaluation and measurement, we tend to get into an instrumental conversation about the methodology of the tool. And you said something in one of your earlier studies about how evidence actually needs an advocate. And to me that says it doesn't just stand on itself. It actually, you don't know it when you see it. And we in the development sector have a challenge of being able to scale our own evidence and learning because we tend to get stuck in the fact that nothing is generalizable. So I'm curious about whether you can talk a little bit more about what do you mean when you say evidence needs an advocate?
Well, I think maybe I should say evidence needs demand, but before there can be real demand. So we want to see the USAID administrator come out and say, okay, for the big ticket items in my portfolio, I want to see the attributable impact of my money. They're doing something very positive in the Millennium Challenge Corporation in this sense. So we need that demand right from the top, and that means that they also instruct or they are setting the expectation that they would like to know that attributable impact. Some people will argue about attributable impact. Who cares as long as we're going in the right direction? And that may be valid for some kinds of interventions like vaccination where I can just check out who has immunity to certain diseases by taking, or anemia or something like that. But for most of what we do, we're experimenting. We actually don't know that a certain service delivery system is actually going to work to get people retained on antiretrovirals or whatever. So we need to have an advocate in civil society as well, or among the groups that receive money from aid agencies, to care about this impact. The funders, just like shareholders care about profits, I think the development community shareholders need to care about rigorous evidence and evaluation and seeing those results in public. Those are our profits, right? So that's what I mean by having an advocacy movement in this space. There's people who get caught up in the methods. I don't think we should focus on the methods, but what we should focus is on the rigor. It depends on what question we're trying to answer. It depends on the case we're trying to make to a policymaker. But what I feel very strongly about is that a program like the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief They're doing something really interesting now, and they're looking at how to reach adolescent girls, for example. And for the first time, there's a rigorous impact evaluation alongside, because we actually don't know what it takes to reach adolescent girls and prevent HIV incidence. That's the kind of thing that we need to start seeing. We can't, and then the other question is, like, if I'm going to turn over PEPFAR to a coast country government, what's the cost of that? Is it cost effective? What is the level of coverage? We have a lot of nice ideas and rhetoric up here, but what about, where the budget limits hit the road in country?
Got it. Great. So we have 10 minutes left, and I did, as promised, want to turn it over to you to ask at least one round of questions, and then hopefully we can get another really rapid round. And it looks like we have a question there. If you could please just introduce yourself and keep your question very quick.
Tom Timber, consultant. I want to thank the panel for one of the most stimulating panels I've heard in a long time. It is the case, however, that there have been a lot of post-studies over the years. AID has gone through at least 2 cycles of programs to commission them over the last 20 or 30 years. The World Bank and the IMF have these independent evaluation offices who primarily do them. So one of the things to consider, and you really raised them, is the political economy that permits them to occur. Indeed, one of the big problems is the projectification of aid, and so other kinds of sources of funds are needed. But I want to suggest that there are 2 others, or 3 others, that are present, which I have seen over my life. One of them is that they are, once you start talking about 5, 10, 15, in some cases 50 years. I once did a study of 50 villages which had prominent development programs in them in the teens and 20s in India. I went to them. 3 of them were now sunk under suburbs of major Indian cities, because that's where people tend to do projects. So confounding problems. And then there's also the reluctance of all organizations to really do evaluations. And as you know, with the bank and the fund, the question is how independent the IEOs are. So if the speakers could address the political economy, I do have one thing to suggest for you, the fact that the missions generated a lot of these things. I suspect it has to do with the national employees who are sub rosa very influential, often committed to projects they worked on 10, 20 years ago, and when they become senior enough, I think they often promote some studies to perhaps refocus on those fields. Thank you.
Great, thank you. There was a question over here.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. My name is Susana Carrillo. I worked, thank you for this excellent panel. I mean, it's something that it's been on my mind for years. I worked more than 20 years in the field with UN and with the bank and headquarters. So I think that what I learned is that the issue of evaluation, it's not just a technical, the technical process that you use or the technical tools of you and Melissa, you mentioned very from the beginning of your intervention. My concern is about the political economy, the drivers for people that are working. I work closely with the independent evaluation group as well and see how they, carry out their interviews in midterms evaluation and end of terms evaluations. And this is an issue that is extremely complex. It's about drivers, it's about incentives, and most of the time these issues are not addressed. I mean, the organizations do restructurings, remodeling, shifting, but they really don't look deep inside. They really don't take the time to engage at the local level. In most of the countries where if we are talking about alleviating poverty, we need to focus first on post-conflict and fragile states where the levels of poverty are higher, and those are the countries where they have weaker institutions, they have no capacity to monitor and evaluate. So my question is, what are we really doing about changing the structures, the drivers, and the commitment at higher levels? Because if there is no real commitment at high levels, recognition this is a really complex issue that needs to be addressed from several perspectives. What are your recommendations to move forward?
Got it. And one more question. I'm going to go back there.
Thank you very much. Alex Eze here at the Center for Global Development. Thanks again for the excellent panel this morning. One of the points I've not heard from the panel is the issue of independence of the evidence. How important is it? And are we doing a disservice to the field when we bundle up the generation of that evidence with the implementation of the programs?
Great. So just to do a bit of just a really quick rapid round, there seems to be an issue around sort of how long is long. There are a couple of questions around the political economy and what recommendations and thoughts the panel has around that. I think that there is a bit of a question around sort of still the rigor around the independence piece, Amanda, that maybe you might want to take. And then I do think that there is, and what I hear is, yes, this is complex, but there's some evidence, and then there's decision makers, and there's this like magic middle that happens somewhere where evidence helps to inform decisions. That doesn't seem to be happening. That feels could be a little bit unpacked. And so I turn to my panelists to see who wants to take any of the three questions. Quickly, because we only have 5 minutes left.
Well, I'm happy to speak to the last question first, and I'm in violent agreement with you. As an implementer, we are generally asked to evaluate our own work, which is really a funny thing to do if you think about it. It's helped somewhat by the sense that there is an independent research agency there that is typically hired to do that. But I think that the premise of your question is still sound and was raised by the first commenter in terms of some of the internal groups at the various development institutions evaluating their own work. And the more that we could have more independent evaluation, I think the better.
Great. Amanda?
I mean, on that same issue, I think 3IE, for example, was developed for that very purpose, right? The idea that in any given project, you would, fund the implementation, and then maybe you would contract the evaluation separately. A lot of people have mentioned the independent evaluation groups that are associated with the multilateral development banks, and one question is, should the Gates Foundation have an independent evaluation group? A la multilateral development banks. I feel very conflicted about that idea, I have to say, because I think you have to be there at the start of implementation to be able to have a design that allows you to answer the question that you're asking or to inform policymakers. So you have to be both together and apart at the same time. That said, I certainly have seen lots of pressure when you get bad news or news that you don't expect from evaluation to change those results. Even when you're an independent group, when you come out with results that are not always 100% what people would like to see, there's a lot of unhappiness and pressure brought to bear. So I think perhaps the first thing to address is, unless the big funders really buy into rigor and independence and want to see those results and do not punish results that are disappointing, that's learning, that we do that so that we can adjust approach later, we're going to be stuck in this very negative political economy that will not value rigor, evidence, adjustment over time. Like any portfolio, some things are going to work and some things aren't going to work. And they might work now or they might work later. So I think changing that whole culture, that has to happen right at the top.
Great. And Melissa, any thoughts on that round?
I guess I'll take the how long is long term, and I would say that that really depends on the question that you have at hand. Do you have questions about sustainability 20 years after something has completed? We have actually some work on family planning in Central America that has taken that perspective. You would evaluate using certain methods and lots of limitations based on that timing, but you would evaluate at a certain time and using certain methods based on the questions. And so I don't think that I would advocate for any kind of standard 5 years after the end of an intervention is the minimum threshold for ex post evaluation, or 3 years, or 10. I think it really needs to be a more nuanced understanding of the questions and the timing and the methods.
Great. So my timekeeper has told me that I have 1 minute left, so we cannot do another round. However, the panelists will be around. right after, so please feel free to pick up on the questions. In wrapping up, I would really like to get everyone's one-sentence point of view on fast forward. In one sentence, how would the development sector change if long-term impact assessments were incorporated into every project? One sentence. I said it 3 times now.
I think Will should go first.
Go, Will. Rapid fire.
How many sentences?
One.
The tweet.
I think that
You thought about this.
the development world would work more like the business world in that interventions that didn't have long-term impact would go out of business, and those that did would grow.
Perfect. Amanda?
Well, I have a colleague who has a famous paper called "It Pays to Be Ignorant," all about the political economy of not wanting to know what's happening with your own performance and impact. But I'd like to see a future where it pays to be informed and evidence generating.
I like that compound sentence. Melissa? One sentence.
One sentence about the future. I think we would have a different set of incentive structures around measurement and accountability that would allow the longer term view of impact and not just the short term result.
Great. So thank you very much, everyone. Please give our panelists a round of applause. I've been told to let you know that you have a 10-minute break. Be back here for 10:30. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Teresa Osborne. I'm the Deputy Chief Economist at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and I'm thrilled to be here moderating a panel on a subject we hold near and dear, which is cost effectiveness. This group of organizations takes the issue of cost effectiveness seriously, as do we, but approaches it with different perspectives. And so I think this is a great opportunity to learn what they're learning and discuss different approaches to cost effectiveness and what that brings to the development outcomes agenda. So first, I'd like to introduce the panel. Here, way on our right, is Keely Sloan. She is Program Manager in Agriculture and Development at the Sustainable Food Lab. Just next to her is Elijah Goldberg. He's co-founder and chief operating officer at Impact Matters. And Joao Brito is global manager of sustainable development at AB InBev, the world's largest brewer, Anheuser-Busch. He leads program design and impact measurement at the company's small retailer development program. So I'm going to start with questions for Keely. So Keely, to get an accurate sense of which interventions and programs are cost effective, you need to have a common metric, a common definition, if you will, of cost effectiveness that's relevant for your objectives. Could you tell us a little bit about Sustainable Food Lab's progress in that objective and how you've been approaching it so far?
Sure. Good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know, the Sustainable Food Lab is a global network of organizations facilitating market-based change to make a more sustainable food system. So we work with a number of member and partner organizations in the food and beverage industry. And probably around the early 2010s, we started to see that a lot of our members who had adopted certification standards were realizing that although those had a lot of benefits, they really needed a little bit more in-depth view into what was really going on in their supply chains. And so with that, we saw companies starting to develop performance measurement systems of their own. And they mostly did that individually and developed them without any sort of collaboration, which brought up two main issues. The first being wasted resources, both in terms of companies trying to figure out how and what to measure in different contexts and different crops and geographies. And then also suppliers were having to answer the same types of questions in slightly different forms, and that was just creating a lot of wasted resources and time for the suppliers. And then the second opportunity was just a big lost opportunity for learning. So with different metrics, even around the same crops or geographies or supply chains, you couldn't compare learnings, and so there was no learning there. And so we were approached by some of our members that were interested in creating a standardized metric for smallholder farmers and smallholder supply chains. And so with that, the Sustainable Food Lab gathered 70 organizations, a little more than 70, so that was companies, NGOs, and research organizations, one of which who was formerly SAB Miller, now AB InBev, was a really great partner in this, so great to be up here with you, Joao. And we formed the community of practice on smallholder performance measurement. And so companies, through this, were looking to really have a scalable and cost-effective system. So not necessarily to look at impact, but to be able to track progress over time. And the key to this was really balancing affordability and scalability with the need for robustness and rigor. So really cost-effective performance measurement. So the community of practice lasted for about 6 years, and just so you know a little bit of the process, we co-designed the shared approach to smallholder performance measurement, which is this. You can find that on our website. And with all of the organizations that were involved. So we had small working groups that got together, both with companies, thematic experts, and performance measurement experts. They would come up with top-line indicators, bring those back to the group for discussion and then inclusion in the shared approaches. And what we saw companies doing from this was really taking out the indicators that they found most useful, either based on their priorities or their sourcing context, and then using those and being able to talk more effectively about what they were seeing. And then the community of practice largely morphed into learning about data collection, use, and decision-making based on results. So we saw really 5 main results from this community of practice. The first is that we saw companies just measuring a lot more because they just had more access to indicators on themes that might have been either off their radar or that they didn't have enough resources to actually look into how and why to measure those things. We also saw that at the same time, suppliers were less overburdened because they were able to collect the same metrics and then report out to different companies, which was a big cost saver for many of them. And then we also saw that using common metrics across programs and crops just made measurement and learning a lot easier, even within one company. And this ultimately also reduced the cost of doing business. And then also tracking differences between projects and crops. So being able to better compare projects and setting them up to have that conversation on cost effectiveness in different contexts. Finally, we saw that companies were able to talk with each other better about what they were seeing on the ground, which was really the purpose of starting the community of practice in the onset.
If I could just follow up, maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on how the use of cost effectiveness metrics as a decision tool. Can you point to any specific examples, or how do you see progress in actually affecting the investment decisions or the programming decisions across your membership?
Yeah. So I think the first part of that answer is just that in the last 15 to 20 years, the food and beverage industry has come a long way in, starting with certification and then moving on to performance measurement, just in the knowledge and the investment that they have in their supply chains. And it's really empowered companies to be able to make better decisions for a more sustainable supply chain, and in some case be pressured to make better decisions for a more sustainable supply chain. In terms of companies working together, one of our first big wins was around a meta study that we did. So at one of the community practice meetings, we invited companies to bring in metric sets that they already had. And we saw that there were 5 different studies on the same crop in the same geography. So namely, we had Nestle, Mars, Starbucks, IFC, Ecom, and IDH had all done cocoa livelihood studies in Côte d'Ivoire between 2012 and 2013 separately. And so we hired a third party to go through and see what learnings we could gather. And that in and of itself at the time was just a huge success, getting these companies to share the results of their studies in a way where we could compare them to enhance learning. But the process was also an example of just how far you can go without common metrics. So some of the areas like context and demographics were very well aligned, very easy to learn from. And then in the livelihoods and well-being category, we had 3 out of 17 indicators that we could even possibly compare. But altogether, the insights provided a deeper and broader understanding of the situation of the farmers in Côte d'Ivoire and provided a much more credible picture than any one study could have done individually. Also just a good lesson to the industry that, saving money and doing studies together and then sharing the pre-competitive data is really useful. And on that note, we later saw the development of Cocoa Action from the World Cocoa Foundation, where 9 cocoa companies currently collect a common set of metrics around their 2 pillars, which are productivity and thriving communities. And they do that for shared action, learning, and improvement. And that's a big cost saver to do these programs collaboratively instead of each company working in its own silo, sometimes even crossing the same populations and geographies. And now that same cocoa sector is currently engaged in 2 living income benchmark studies in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, which I won't go into, but if you have questions on that, you can ask me later. But we still work in a competitive space, so a lot of the gains were for individual companies and not necessarily as collaborative. And I think one of the best examples of that is Nestle's Rural Development Framework, They rolled that out in 2013 to assess sustainability of farmer livelihoods across their sourcing areas, both to ensure long-term supply, and deliver on their ambition of shared value, so value for the company and for the farmer. And as of now, they've conducted a baseline in 18 markets. They collect over 30 indicators in 8 core areas. And it's really given them ability both to communicate better across their sourcing areas, but also just to have more credible reporting to partners and stakeholders, and has allowed them to take a truly global approach to their sourcing. And actually, in some cases, they promote data sharing between with other companies that are working in the area that provide services that are adjacent to theirs. So they've worked with Bayer and Syngenta and Vodafone to help kind of fill in those service gaps that they see when they do these large baseline studies. So that's just a good example of improving learning and cost effectiveness, and also making programming more effective by aligning priorities across a certain area. This is also a really good example of performance management being embedded in the operations of a company instead of linked to a project which will end, which is something that we always like to stress, but can be really challenging for companies for a variety of reasons. And then in terms of challenges to looking at or incorporating cost effectiveness, I was talking with my colleagues at the Food Lab, and one challenge really rose to the top, and I thought that I would say it here, because it seems like a good audience to say it to. But you'd think that companies would be ahead of the game when it comes to cost effectiveness and return on investment in livelihood programs, because they're so good at it in procurement. But when it comes to development type work, they really often rely on their development partners, their NGO partners, to tell them, what the best thing is to implement and why, and how that will affect their business model. And so this is just kind of a pitch to, if you do have information about cost effectiveness or ROI, or you can get that information through implementing programs with other companies or in other areas, being able to present that information to a company if you're trying to win them on to ideas that they may be interested but may seem more abstract to their business model, like voluntary savings and loan or weather insurance, could really go a long way, I think. So that's just to end with the importance of cost-effectiveness measurement.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I'm sure people are going to have lots of follow-up questions. Elijah, I'd like to turn to you. In your view, Keely has explained some of the challenges and some of the purposes and successes of, I feel like I'm echoing, of this agenda. So what, in your view, how can we better do cost effectiveness and incorporate it into the decisions in the development sector, throughout the development sector, in your view?
Absolutely. So thanks for having me. Thank you to TechnoServe. I work with Impact Matters. We're a fairly young nonprofit, and we actually worked with TechnoServe about 6 months ago or so to conduct impact audits on their program. So an impact audit is a short-term engagement with a nonprofit where we essentially create a cost-effectiveness estimate for a nonprofit's programs and then rate the quality of evidence behind that. So it's really a pleasure to work with the TechnoServe team, and it's a pleasure to be here. So the question is, how do you actually use cost effectiveness to make better decisions in the nonprofit sector? I think the first question is, why would you, in the international development sector, I will say nonprofit consistently because that's who we talk to. In the international development sector, how do you use cost effectiveness to make better decisions? So the first question is, why would you care about cost effectiveness? And Amanda started to make the case, and I'll just reiterate it. It's really a moral imperative to measure cost effectiveness for programs that you're funding. There's an opportunity cost of every dollar. If it's spent someplace, it's not being spent someplace else. And if what you're spending it on, you don't know the effectiveness of it, it could very well be ineffective, and you could very well be wasting that dollar. So as a result, it's absolutely essential to know, are the interventions that you're pouring money into the ones that are actually achieving your mission? And that gets to the second point, which is there's a lot of talk about comparability of metrics. There's a lot of talk about cost effectiveness at kind of a global level in terms of, you may be familiar with GiveWell or similar effective altruist organizations. at the end of the day, cost effectiveness is based on the mission of the organization that's giving the funds. So cost effectiveness can only be done from the perspective of that organization's mission. So as a result, it's really not a tool to impose decisions on an organization. It's a tool for an organization to best make decisions based on what it's trying to achieve in the world. The point of allocation is crucial. So the whole idea behind doing cost effectiveness is that if we do it correctly, if it's based on mission, it can help us make better allocations. We can give money towards programs that are going to do more of the good that we want to see happen. Obviously, it's not a sufficient source of information. So, any good investor will rely on a financial audit. They will obviously demand it before they make any sort of investment in a company, but they're not just going to make it solely on the basis of the financials. An impact audit or a cost effectiveness statement is has a similar role. The final point is that it's a valuable tool to make decisions. It's also a valuable tool to track progress, and it's also a valuable tool to demonstrate your effectiveness to others. So, at the end of the day, it's a worthwhile investment for almost any organization that can measure the impact of their programs.
So, could you give us some examples of practical, efficient ways of measuring cost effectiveness that you've come across?
Yeah. So I would break it down into two buckets. So one bucket is the question of data, and one bucket is the question of analysis. So when it comes to data, there's two sides that go into any cost effectiveness estimate. So there's the costs to deliver the program or the outputs, and there's the outcomes that are achieved based on those outputs. And the key thing with costs is just to make sure that you match costs with outcomes. That's it. Usually it's fairly easy to measure. If you're having trouble measuring the cost side, then probably there are deeper problems that need to be addressed in the program. But that's more or less it. Now you can get more complex. You can look at social costs, costs to the beneficiaries that you work with, costs to other partners, to government, and so forth. But at the end of the day, what's most important to figure out is what you're spending to achieve those outcomes. So as long as you match those with impacts, you should be fine. On the impact side, it obviously gets much more challenging. And this is where the for-profit and the nonprofit sector diverge. The for-profit sector, you count up your costs, you count up your income, you subtract and you get your profit, and that's your counterfactual outcome. That's what you've achieved. You get to take that home. In the nonprofit sector, it's much more difficult to count counterfactual outcomes. So you may be working with somebody, you may be tutoring a class in high school. 80% of the members of that class graduate high school. Did you help? Did you not help? Did you get all 80% graduated? Did you get none of them graduated? So this is where we have to turn to impact evaluation. And impact evaluation at its core is really trying to get at that question of counterfactual. So what would have happened to those participants in the absence of the program? And there are many different ways of doing that with increasing rigor. So the most rigorous that I'm sure we've all heard about is a randomized trial. You're splitting participants into one group and the other. Randomly, you're watching them progress over time, and then you're comparing differences. And that's as good as it gets in terms of identifying what the counterfactual is. But there are a number of methods that fall below that are not as good, not as rigorous, but will still tell you something about what would have happened. So crucial is to select what the right method is for your program. Some programs will do RCTs. TechnoServe has done one, Village Enterprise here. So there are, we were talking about political economy earlier. It's arguable that the nonprofits themselves are doing a lot more to push this forward than at the top, but that's neither here nor there. And then the question is whether that data can be all internal or if you also need to combine it with external data. So sometimes you're able to do, start to finish collecting data on your participants. Sometimes you're able to collect data on important interim benchmarks, which you can then link to your final outcome using, the external literature. So that's the data side of it. And then the question is on the analysis side. So there are two approaches to this. Both are relatively easy and straightforward. One is to do it in-house. It sounds daunting, but at the end of the day, all you're doing is adding up impacts and adding up costs and dividing. So it's, there's decisions to be made, but it can be overcome. And then the second is to go with an external provider. And so Impact Matters, we conduct impact audits. Again, since it's no primary data collection to do the actual cost effectiveness calculation, it's typically a couple $1,000s to get an assessment on a program. So it's a very attainable piece of analysis that can then do a lot to inform how you make decisions.
Okay, fascinating. To Joao, so your program works with about 20,000 small retailers across, I guess, Africa and Latin America primarily. And the aim is to help these small enterprises have higher business incomes and help them remain, I guess, a sustainable outlet, right? So how does your company balance the sort of the profit and the social objectives in pursuing this program and thinking about cost effectiveness as well?
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, TechnoServe and the center for having us. I think to Kilu's point, we have much more questions than answers. But in a way, inspired by the example of many organizations, many of which are in this room today, there are a couple of principles that we try to follow consistently across our impact measurement work. I think the first one is actually using shared metrics. So we developed a list of 107 common metrics that all our programs globally use to track the performance, really encompassing the whole theory of change from inputs to impacts. And some of those metrics are specific to us, while other metrics are like more cross-sector wide metrics, such as IPA's Poverty Probability Index. And really then what we do is to pull up all these metrics together in a scorecard using visualization tools such as Microsoft BI to really have this compelling view at a global level of what are common challenges, insights, and strengths across our programs. I think the second principle we try to apply is measuring holistically. And by this we mean looking at effectiveness broadly. Really looking at what are the diverse types of value that we are bringing to diverse types of external and internal stakeholders. I think we recognize that no organization can solve today the challenges that we have by itself. And I think that if we are to collaborate, then we need to enhance our capability to establish dialogues about the broader benefits of these programs. And for us, that means measuring not only the impact that these programs have in the retailers' livelihoods, but also measuring diligently why having empowered, connected, resilient, modernized retailers are important for us as a business that wants to stay in business for the next 100 years to come. And I think the last principle, principle number 3, is being lean. So we all know that social impact data sometimes is hard and expensive to get. And in a way, inspired by the example of Acumen with their lean data approach, we've been trying to leverage low-cost technologies to get robust data with acceptable levels of evidence at faster, quick feedback loops. So to test this, we're actually running interactive voice response surveys with an organization called Endwider across 7 markets. And through these interactive voice response surveys, we're managed to track longitudinally over time how our retailers score in relation to different types of indicators. All the calls are anonymous, and they receive airtime for every completed questionnaire. And we do the questionnaires in a way to not lead the answers away, and really following rules of how to gather sensitive data through a mobile-based survey. So I think, in short, we're doing this with 2,000 retailers testing in 7 markets with response rates of 50%. So I would and then connecting to another principle, to still being lean, what we also do is to leverage our supply chain, as Kilu was mentioning. We have weekly touch points with 2 million small businesses across the world. These touch points, we can leverage them to collect data. We already do. And we can enhance the scope of the data that we collect. So in short, shared metrics, measuring holistically, and being lean.
Okay, and Do you see the measurement and the data capture for cost effectiveness calculations as inducing more private entrepreneurs or private companies to get into to embrace development objectives? And if so, how do you see that?
So I think cost effectiveness is a concept that we value and we understand as a business. But my challenge is really whether that's actually the right term. Because it frames what we all aspire to do here in this room as a cost that needs to be borne, rather than an investment that can generate multiple sources of value for communities, customers, families, and also business. And so for us, that means when we're evaluating the cost effectiveness within our retail development programs, we look at what are we investing in terms of financial capital, but also human resources. And then we try to understand how those investments connect to different levers of value across all these dimensions of stakeholders to build a more holistic and compelling business case. And I think we would be able to enable greater private sector engagement if we would only frame cost effectiveness as investment effectiveness, and we would look at effectiveness with this broader holistic viewpoint of the value that we're generating for a diverse set of stakeholders.
Okay, and so would that actually improve the profits of your company, and sort of through what channels, if I may push a little more on that? How do you balance them?
I think connecting to the discussion on the first panel, I think you balance them when you think of long term. And we know it's hard. We have, our quarter reports. Our incentives, connecting to our previous discussion, are very short-term incentives. But I think what we try to do, and it's balance. We can balance them when we start to bring long-term perspectives into this work. The fact is, we might not see immediate levels of return over 2-3 years. We would not expect to see that level of return or returns that are comparable to traditional commercial investments. But actually, when you build the case of looking up on the long term, and the broader benefits that you generate, and the long-lasting effects of those returns, then that's when you're able to build a compelling, also commercial business case.
Okay, thank you for that. Before we go to Q&A, did anybody want to ask each other a question? I have a question for Elijah, if that's all right.
Sure.
When you, because at MCC, we try to put everything in terms of a same value metric, which is income, essentially. So we calculate a social rate of return, if you will. So I'm just wondering, since you're looking at a broad array of different social objectives and different metrics, whether you see a value in trying to make them more comparable across objectives or sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. That goes back exactly to the question of mission. So if your mission is to boost income, then it makes sense to translate every intervention that you're assessing into a metric of income. If your mission though is to save child lives, obviously that's not an appropriate metric, and you wouldn't want to use that. But here, this comes an interesting activity here, which is to, cost effectiveness in and of itself has a unit, right? It's a dollar compared to some outcome. But you can always assign weights to those outcomes and turn that into a benefit cost ratio, and therefore get your social return on investment. So you can say, I value, income and assets, and I'm placing a weight of this on assets, this on income. I can therefore combine those and get to a unitless figure, which includes how much my dollar yields in terms of some social value. So it's not, I guess the point being, it's not, it's a totally appropriate way of doing this work, but only if your mission allows it.
Right. Okay, so People are anxious to start asking questions. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. Who would like to ask the first question? I see a hand up over there. Would you just introduce yourself very quickly and try to be concise in your questioning so more people get a chance?
Hi. Yes, I will do my absolute best. I'm Kate. I work for Ipsos. Ipsos is a global research and advisory company. And I just want to make a quick comment and then ask my question. I think I would disagree with a couple of things that were said on the panel. First, I think companies that are doing sustainability and social work do not always look at profit as their measure of impact. I think the ones that are farthest along the trajectory see the programs that they work in as integral to their business future. I have an example, but I'll skip that in the interest of time. The second thing is the focus on RCTs is the most rigorous form of impact evaluation research. I find to be doing the research kind of industry as a whole a huge disservice. There's multiple ways that impact can be rigorously measured that aren't an RCT. Those are my two comments. My question is on attribution. And so I was wondering if experience attribution is a major issue, obviously, in measuring impact, and if any of you guys have good examples of where you've been able to get at that.
Thank you. Let's take a couple more before we turn back to the panelists. Who else has a question? I see a hand over here, right here. To your right, there you go.
Hi, so I'm Allie. I'm from the U.S. State Office of General Counsel. Just for the summer, I'm going to be a law student, a second-year law student. So my question is for Keely, actually. So you mentioned that multiple companies were doing the same study and that to consolidate the studies is more cost-effective. But my question is, in those multiple studies they did on the same populations, were you able to cross-reference data and sort of come up with a more credible point where they overlapped? And so is there a benefit in maybe doing multiple studies on the same thing instead?
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Everything was so clear. Oh, here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Leslie Wingender. I'm with Mercy Corps. And my question is for Zhao and your comment about common indicators across your programs or projects. And I wanted to know how you kept them common enough and then also adapted them, or how did you work for the different contexts, maybe in the countries or even between projects. If you could talk a little bit about how you keep that dynamic both culturally sensitive.
Okay, one more question and then maybe we'll have time for a second round as well. I see a hand up.
Hi, my name's Natasha. I work at the World Bank. My question is for Keely, and I was wondering, you said you've promoted this standardized metric, and I'm wondering how well received it's been, how you got players around the table to make sure they were all part of that, and if that's kind of rolled out across the industry now, and what suggestions you would have for other sectors for doing the same sort of thing.
Okay, thank you for those questions. Why don't we start with Keely? She was asked specifically about the value in having multiple studies and whether they found that in this particular case. It would be interesting to hear. And also how well received the establishment of more common metrics has been in the development community.
Sure, and thank you for those. So I think to the first question, the multiple studies, bringing them together did definitely provide them more credibility, but when you look at it, there were 5 studies going on, the same crop, same geography, that without the community of practice never would have known about each other. And so instead of doing random studies of the same people, which is also really burdensome on the population if you end up surveying the same person more than once, being able to collaborate to create a joint study that looks at the same factors and shares at least the pre-competitive part of that data, and then maybe doing a follow-up study for credibility seems just like a lot more efficient use of resources and gives a lot more resources to be able to do more studies of that sort or more in-depth studies. So I think that is the major point, that at least knowing what's happening on the ground is always an added benefit, especially because in cocoa in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, there's so many companies that are working in kind of a not a small area, but in the same sourcing regions. And then, did that answer your question? Okay. For the community of practice, our member companies, so the Sustainable Food Lab just has member companies and partner organizations. And so we're in regular contact with a large portion of the food and beverage industry. And we were actually approached by our members to start this community of practice. So I think people were really interested from the onset just because they were hearing lots of complaints from their suppliers that they were needing to collect too much data and it was really inconsistent. And so that was a really good impetus to form it. Once we had the shared metrics, as I said, the companies didn't just adopt broadly, all of the shared metrics in the shared approaches. And so they were kind of picking and choosing ones that were best suited to their priorities and to the context in which they were working. And it's kind of morphed and evolved since then, but I think the best value that's come out of it is just that, we don't have slightly different measurements of, say, what a household is. And, companies still will, but there's a much better chance that you're going to be able to compare apples to apples instead of having data sets that could be really informative to use together or to talk about together that just aren't comparable because of wording in a question or something like that. Because often when companies do compare data, they're not comparing raw data either, they're comparing the results, so that kind of gets a little bit trickier too.
Okay, and then we had about 3 other questions. One was on the possibility and maybe even advantages of using other research techniques apart from RCTs, which, as we know, there are other ways to identify impacts. And so maybe Elijah, maybe Joao would also like to speak to that. And the issue of sustainability, where we're talking about a broader conception of company objective beyond profitability. And finally, to Joao, I think it was posed whether the indicators are really common enough, because as we know, projects can be so different, contexts can be so different, and if you've seen them as being common enough to really derive comparative insights. So maybe Elijah?
I can take the question about RCTs. The point is very well taken. RCTs are considered the gold standard for attribution, but they're by no means the only approach. And in many, many situations, they're not appropriate for budget constraints, for other reasons. The problem with any approach below, not of the grade of a well-conducted randomized trial, is that you're going to start seeing things that will bias the results. So that may be something like selection bias most commonly, other factors where you're going to be picking up something else other than the effect of the treatment, and therefore either overestimating or underestimating the treatment. But it's a trade-off, right? So no evaluation, if your baseline is no evaluation and your only option is RCTs, and you're ignoring everything in between, then odds are you're going to stay at baseline. As opposed to groups like, to call out Village Enterprise again, which have had a long history of evaluation, they didn't jump immediately into an RCT in year 1. They've been building up an in-house system of outcomes measurement with flaws and all the rest, leading up to a point where they were ready to go into an RCT. So that's often what we like to see, is that there's not, if you were trying to estimate the cost effectiveness of nonprofits or development organizations with an RCT, there are 500 of them out there, and we could give you the list, right? They are a fraction of the development world. And so we need to resort to other methods that still get at that question of attribution and do it pretty well, but don't do it as exceptionally well as an RCT will do. Does that make sense? Sure. No, I'm happy to get pushback.
I'll push back. There are econometric methods. There are econometric methods to solve some of these problems of bias that you describe, and I think that the development community could do better at reaching out to the cutting edge of the research community.
No, absolutely. What we do is we'll take a study which we know has X, Y, and Z biases, and we'll correct it as a result. and you can still get a pretty good answer out of it. There's no doubt about that. But but at the end of the day, the whole value of an RCT is that it's using random assignment to create two comparable populations. And econometrically, you can do a lot to try and get something approximating that.
Okay.
Which may be nearly
Great.
as good.
Wow, you had a couple of questions directed to you as well on the corporate objectives and on commonness of indicators.
Yeah, thank you. So also adding on to that, what we typically use also from our standpoint, we really like the idea of standards of evidence. So because the RCTs they might be also kind of the gold standard, but they tell you if it works, but they don't really tell you how or why it worked. And so typically we try to rely, before we actually get to an RCT kind of standpoint, we actually, for our initial pilots, we tend to rely a lot on correlation evidence. We don't overcome the attribution problem, but actually it generates so much learning at a fraction of the cost that then it allows us to iterate our models until then the models might be ready for us to do an RCT and get some kind of more resilient validity for the pilot suite that we are undertaking. Then on the question on the indicators, I think Keely would probably even talk better than I on this, but developing common metrics is really hard work. It is. And it takes so much discussion. We are a company that operates in over 50 markets, and you don't develop common metrics by imposing metrics on the markets. You really need to co-create them, to co-create with the markets. I think so far we are at a point where we were able to identify a couple of metrics that all markets are comfortable using. On, for instance, the small retailer context, one of the metrics that all markets are using is, for instance, how many of our small retailers assign themselves a salary. That's an indication of how well they manage their business, but also it correlates with their ability kind of to save and to plan their lives appropriately. And so that was kind of a metric that all markets were able to buy in. But then we have metrics that, if they're very culturally specific, then the markets can actually add them onto the study to kind of address both the need for us to have kind of a global view and the more local view around their cultural specificities. But it is hard work. It takes so much time, so much discussion. But I think as people then start to have kind of these global dashboards and they're able to compare, then they start seeing the value of it. And I think it's a never-ending process, really. I think, as Rilke used to say, there is the art of living the questions. The question on finding common metrics is a question that you live, and you never get to total comfort.
That's a great answer. I think there's time for just one more quick round, just maybe 30 seconds each. If you could just tell me what is the number one thing, if you could change one thing in how the development community uses and embraces cost effectiveness, what would it be? Just not an easy question for 30 seconds.
I think it would be great if cost effectiveness could be something that is measured more frequently and presented better to private sector possible partners as a way to better engage them in projects that may be a little bit of a harder sell. Because I think a lot of companies want to go there, and a lot of times it's just selling it up that is the problem. And so if you give companies the kind of the data that they need to make that sale, I think we could engage companies even more so than we are now.
Elijah?
I would say hold themselves accountable to achieving their mission, which by necessity requires cost effectiveness data. You need to know if you're doing it.
Hard to disagree with that. Zhao?
I think I would say maybe being transparent around, of course, what works, but especially around what doesn't work. Like in the past, for instance, we discovered that our small retail development programs had, last year, dropout rates of 50%. So for every 100 retailers that we would select to the program, only 50 would show up and graduate. And as we started sharing insights with our organizations, we actually learned that this was actually a cross-cutting theme across a lot of the actors doing this work. And through that, we generated insights that allowed us today to have participation rates of 70%. And I think that was a conversation and an improvement that was possible because there was transparency around something that didn't work. And if we look at RCTs that are published, you will see a strong bias towards RCTs that are published with, you guessed it, positive results.
Well, I have to say, I found this discussion fascinating, and I hope that.
I was going to say, if you look at the websites of international development organizations, also a lot of things that work. No numbers, though.
So I think we could spend, days on each plumbing the insights of this panel, but unfortunately we are out of time. I'd like to thank the panelists very much and the audience as well for your participation. And at this stage, I'd like to invite Kate Scaife-Diaz up to introduce the next entertainment for us.
All right, we are going to move directly into our last panel of the day. We're going to start talking about the action bit of our evidence to action continuum with a lively debate format. But first, I'd like to, in order to give us a chance to allow our panel to exit the stage and get a few more chairs up here, I'm going to share with you a video from a project that TechnoServe implemented in Tanzania last year called Business Women Connect. This is sharing the voices of a woman who participated in the program. And it's really going to set the stage for the topic that we're about to discuss. So let's watch the video and allow you guys to take your seats. Thank you. So we go on.
Mimi nilikuwa nafanya tu bale biashara, nauza hiki, nilikuwa sijui maana ya mavazi naweza nikaweka, na mume wangu naye tumepanga angalau akipata hata naye pengine. Napoona wanawake wenzangu nikifika pale kwenye mafunzo najikuta siko peke yangu. Kwa hiyo inanipa changamoto na mimi inanipa moyo. Kumbe sio mimi peke yangu. Kwa hiyo kumbe tuko wengi. Kwa na mimi inanipa moyo wa kuweza kuendelea na mafunzo. Naume wengi huwa hawasaidiwa wake zao. Hao alikuwa ananipa support kwa sababu ya kiuchumi kwa kweli, ili tuweze kusaidiana maisha, tusaidiane kimaisha.
Wameamka kama hivi sasa hivi wanapopata nafasi ya hizi NGOs za kuelimishwa na nini, nafikiri kwa siku zijazo.
Kwa kweli kuweka akiba ni muhimu. Kumbe wanawake tunaweza kwa kweli.
Great, thanks. So welcome again, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Kate Scaife-Diaz. I'm the Director of Impact at TechnoServe. And what you just saw, as I mentioned, was the voice of a participant of ours in the Business Women Connect program in Tanzania. Business Women Connect is a project that is currently experiencing some of the challenges that I know that many of you in this room have seen in your own work. And that is, it's a program with early evidence of impact that we want to see reach scale. We want to see the benefits that this woman presented to us grow and have other women also in other countries have the same opportunity. And so today we're going to discuss various options that we could take in helping this project to reach scale. And we're going to do it in a very different way than you might typically see in a panel event. We're going to have a debate in which 3 debaters will present different perspectives on how we might help drive this project to scale.
But before we do that, I'll do a brief presentation of what the project is about. And then my co-panelist, Myra Buvinich, Senior Fellow here at CGD, will provide the background on the evidence that we've generated so far for impact in the project. Now, as Amanda mentioned at the beginning of the program, we are still currently accepting and welcoming your comments over Twitter if you're a Twitter user. It's hashtag CGD Talks. So please, if you're finding that a debater has missed a critical point, or if you're finding one of them more compelling than the others and you want to let us know about it, please join the conversation over Twitter so we can get those reactions there as well. So let me first click ahead and give you a bit of a background on Business Women Connect. This is a program funded by ExxonMobil Foundation with the aim of helping women to securely save and invest in the micro enterprises that they own in marketplaces around Tanzania. And our interest was really in making sure that they could invest in their businesses so they could grow their own income. It's a type of approach that TechnoServe has undertaken in multiple projects, in multiple communities around the world. And while we had lots of measurement on our outcomes and how well we've done in helping people to feel more excited about their business, here was an opportunity that we wanted to take to rigorously measure the impact of our business. And so we decided that a randomized control trial was the right approach at this moment to understand better and more deeply how much we generated in impact for our work. So we worked with CGD and World Bank to design the randomized control trial. And in that trial, we tested 2 approaches. In the first approach, we trained women over a 2.5-hour session on savings strategies, and we introduced them to a mobile savings and lending platform called Empowa. Now, Empowa is a readily available product in Tanzania, but in our early assessments of the women that we worked with, we learned that they were not familiar with Empowa, or when they are familiar with Empowa, they felt the learning curve of this product was too high, and so they weren't using it. So we helped break down those barriers, introducing the product to them, helping them to understand how to engage with it, and introducing them to savings skills that would help them to use it in a way that would bring back benefit to their business. We paired that training with weekly SMS reminders that were tailored to their own personalized savings goals. Now, in the second approach, we intensified that model. And we added, instead of just 1 2.5-hour training, we did 12 weeks of 2.5-hour sessions in which we focused on business skills and financial literacy. These sessions took place near women's places of work. In one instance, we ran sessions on a beach because women were caught fish from the lake and we needed to dry them on the beach. And so they didn't want to leave the fish out in the open, and we taught the training on the beach itself. We offered them at multiple times so that women could attend training when it was most accessible to their schedule, and we invited them to bring their children. We used adult training methodologies, which in particular, we used case studies of women or examples of other women micro-entrepreneurs that were relatable. And we asked the women to help the examples in the case studies to make a decision about where they were going to lead their business next, which really helped women to engage with the content. The content itself being a focus on hard skills like finances and soft skills such as negotiation. And finally, here again, we followed up with the SMS reminders tailored to their personalized savings goals. And before I hand it over to Myra, I did want to focus on where we're creating value. As we talked about just a couple minutes ago, we want to understand kind of all the different types of value that we're creating in a development project. And first and foremost for us, our goal was to create value for the women we worked with to help them grow their businesses so that they could invest in their families. We also had a greater social value that we wanted to achieve in empowering women to help them control their finances and be able to spend their money the way they want to. And finally, we have to recognize that there was a value to a mobile service provider. This is Vodacom, who's looking to expand its client base and through us engaged with the population of women that they might not otherwise have been able to incorporate. So keeping those ideas of value in mind, I'll turn it over to Myra to speak to how and whether we achieved impact. Thanks.
Thank you. And before that, a bit of a rationale of why mobile savings. There's a gender gap in access to financial services. It's about 980 million women that are underserved that don't get access to the formal financial sector. But this is what we did. We took randomized control trials, a pool, the universe of randomized control trials on savings instruments between 2004 and 2018, and we did a meta-analysis asking the basic question: if you have access to a very simple savings instrument, formal saving instruments, what would women and what would men do? Out of 100 women, 63 would access the instrument, would buy the service. Only 26 men. So this shows you basically that women prefer savings. There are many reasons for it. I won't go into it. But here you have, out of the 980 million underserved women, many of them would save in the formal financial sector, but don't have access to. And this is how they save. This is actually a woman in the Tanzania study. This is in Mbeya, in one of the cities. So we asked her, well, now she was starting to use Vodafone to save, but we asked her, well, do you save otherwise? She says, yes, I do. I've saved all my life. She took us to her house and she showed us how she saved. She has a little enterprise in the marketplace. She has a jar there where she collects the coins that she makes out of the business. And that jar, she then, when it's filled up, she puts into this huge bag that she has in her house, in her bedroom, under lock. So what she's going to do with that bag is, when she has enough money in that huge bag, she's going to buy a car. But she says, but also, I needed other ways. I need savings for emergencies. So she had somebody make a lockbox. So she puts money for emergency there. Now, you realize the inefficiencies and the dangerousness of having savings this way. Not only, what it would mean to then take all these coins to the bank to change in order to buy a car. So clearly, women want to save, are saving, but have problems in accessing the formal financial sector. And we believe that a lot of it is not only that women do not know how to access the financial sector, the financial system, but that banks and financial sector providers more generally have biases against women clients. So anyway, this is the randomized control trial. As you already know, there was a control group of women who were not offered anything, so the control group. Then we had a group of women who were offered savings, and a group of women who were offered mobile savings and business training. The first and the most important thing I think that one wants to know if the treatments worked. And here is very significant evidence that the mobile savings treatment worked dramatically. The yellow is the Empower group, and women started saving, increased their savings dramatically with the mobile platform. And importantly, however, the business management training, and it's the orange, really boosted the effects of the savings. The second is also very important. Well, but did the business management training work? Because a lot of the randomized control trial evidence that we have in training programs, business management training programs, don't have any significant effects. But why? Because oftentimes the business training is not good enough. So, you know, if you don't learn something different with your business training, obviously that is not going to transfer into better business practices. But here you're seeing the Empower group, who did not receive the business training, did not improve their business practices very much. But the Empower plus the business training group really improved their practices dramatically. Now, this was all at 6 months after the training was done. What are the results? And the results, interestingly enough, 6 months later, there were not significant results on business growth or income growth. It was just too soon. But we see a significant effect on empowerment and increased women's happiness and optimism. Here we have the results on women's happiness and optimism, but we also have results on women's decision-making power. And basically, particularly having the ability to use mobile savings really empowered women. And you know, the business training added to this a bit, but the really significant effect was being able to go down to your mobile phone provider and having this savings. And this goes back to sort of the benefits that mobile savings, a mobile saving platforms brings to women, that includes individual, you know, they can save as individual, their private savings, and this sort of what it does, it reduces pressures that they have to share income with others. And this has a self-reliance and empowerment effect. Without a randomized control trial, we would have never been able to make the attribution of the Empower and the business training group to this outcome. And that, I think, is the incredible value of a randomized control trial, particularly in areas where you don't have any great models. So that's it.
Thank you, Myra. I don't think we'll need this, so I'm just going to store it down here.
And before we move on, I just want to highlight there's so much to dig in on this research. Myself being a research junkie, I would love to hear you talk more about this, but you do have a couple of blog posts, if I'm not mistaken, if you wanted to plug those for us, in case anybody in the audience also wants to continue learning more.
Sure. There's, you know, if you go to the CGD website, there is, we're doing a similar experiment in Indonesia. There is a report on the whole issue of mobile savings that is called Mindful Savings that you can access. There is the report on Tanzania, fact sheets, and also in Indonesia now in the basement. So please access cgd.org.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, now I would like to invite our debaters onto the stage. And as I mentioned before, the debaters will be presenting on 3 different perspectives of how we might drive this project to scale. And I'll introduce them as they come up. Diane Calvi, CEO of Village Enterprise, will be arguing for development impact bonds. Randall Kempner, Executive Director of the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, will argue for corporate partnerships. And finally, Tomas Devas, Acting Special Representative at the State Department for Global Partnerships, Special Representative for Global Partnerships at the State Department, will advocate for traditional donor financing from governments. So Diane, take the floor.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Myra. It was really impressive to see your results from your RCT, and I have a confession to make. I am not an economist or an expert in monitoring and evaluation, but I am a firm believer in using rigorous evidence to evaluate international development projects. And I'd like to pose a question to you that you should consider while evaluating these 3 funding mechanisms. What is the most important goal that you hope to achieve when scaling the Business Women's Connect project? I would guess that it is having this lasting impact on the lives of the women that you are working with. ideally an impact that's backed by evidence. And I'm here to talk to you about one of the most innovative, one of the most cutting-edge new funding mechanisms for international development work. Not only does this mechanism guarantee funding agencies that they are funding programs that are achieving results backed by rigorous evidence, it also provides investors with both a financial return and the social return of solving some of the world's most pressing problems. At Village Enterprise, we work with first-time entrepreneurs, mostly women, and provide them with a sustainable path out of poverty by tapping into their entrepreneurial spirit and helping them start small businesses and savings groups. And like you, we have evidence that our program is both cost-effective and a sustainable approach to ending extreme poverty. So last year, we were selected to launch the first development impact bond in poverty alleviation in Africa. And this new funding has opened the doors to private investors that are willing to commit huge sums of capital. And I believe that with your strong evidence, that you could also tap into this new capital. So before I tell you more about this funding mechanism, I want to tell you a short story about a phone call I recently had with my friend Charlie Bressler, the CEO of The Life You Can Save. The Life You Can Save endorses nonprofits based on their cost of effectiveness and proof of impact. And because Village Enterprise has been endorsed by The Life You Can Save, we've received some donations through The Life You Can Save. But most of them have been in the hundreds or the low thousands. And those of you that do fundraising know that this is pretty typical for a first-time charitable donation. And I was talking to Charlie about the Development Impact Bond. And I was explaining to him that we could provide investors with a return. And Charlie was like, Diane, this is really exciting. I want to introduce you to some of our wealthiest donors. And I know that they are going to be excited about this Development Impact Bond. And I said, well, Charlie, I want to let you know that our minimum investment is $250,000. I said, that's a pretty big first-time commitment to a nonprofit. Are you sure that these investors are going to be interested? And he said, absolutely. I'm going to introduce you to Brian, a private equity investor, and I know that he is going to be interested in this new opportunity. So a week later, I got on the phone with Brian. And I explained to Brian our poverty graduation approach of providing cash transfers, training, and mentoring to first-time entrepreneurs to start businesses and savings groups. And I explained to him that we had recently conducted a large-scale randomized control trial with Innovations for Poverty Action, and that we had strong evidence that our program was very cost-effective, costing anywhere between a third and a tenth of similar programs evaluated with RCTs. Well, Brian's a business guy, so he gets our model. He gets it. But that's not what made me a believer in impact bonds. What came next was really phenomenal. I told Brian that I would like him to invest in helping us scale our program. And I explained to him that USAID Development Innovation Ventures, DFID, and a private foundation had committed $5 million to an outcome fund. And that in an impact bond, private investors finance the program with a financial return when the program delivers measurable results. In our case, increasing income and net assets. And Brian was really intrigued. And I explained to him that he could receive a return of up to 10% annually if we exceeded our results. Pretty interesting, because he would also be getting a social return. The third thing I explained is that the outcome funders were interested
increasing the size of the outcome fund if we were successful. So he immediately understood the leverage of this funding mechanism. And Brian said to me, you know, you said your minimum investment was $250,000. Would you consider an investment of $500,000? Well, I was a bit shocked, and I said, well, yes, Brian, we would consider an investment of $500,000. This is after a 45-minute phone call. I've never met Brian. He's willing to invest $500,000. He said, I'm going to do some due diligence. I'm going to look at your RCT data, and I'm going to look at your financials, and I'm going to get back to you in a week. A week later, Brian called me. Still, I haven't met Brian. But he called me, and he said he was going to make a $500,000 investment in our impact bond. And Brian is not the only one. There's another Brian. It's something about Brians that like to invest in impact bonds, who is a Facebook executive. He made a $1 million investment in the impact bond after just 2 meetings talking about it. And several other entrepreneurs and venture capitalists make investments of $250,000. This was a huge game changer for Village Enterprise. So for the first time, Village Enterprise was able to quickly raise, in just a few months, $2.4 million for our impact bond. And I believe that because of your strong evidence, that you too could have a similar type of success in rapidly raising funding to scale your program, but while at the same time ensuring that you're also having the impact that you wish to achieve. So I'm going to end with the 3 reasons that I feel that development impact bonds are the right way for you to scale your program. Number 1, development impact bonds make funding more effective. By tying the funding to measurable results, you make donors know that their funding programs that work. Number 2, it allows providers to adapt to change. By reimbursing results rather than activities, we ensure that the programs are having the impact that they wish to achieve. And we provide providers like ourselves with the flexibility to do what we need to do to achieve those results. And reason number 3, it focuses the private sector on social issues. By providing investors with a financial return, it opens up a whole new pool of capital not currently available, and at the same time ensures that you continue to have the kind of lasting impact that you hope to have based on rigorous evidence. And I feel so strongly about this impact bond and its ability to help you scale. I would like to offer you the opportunity to tap into the outcome fund that we have already created. And we have spent 18 months working on this, and you won't have to do that because all of the legal contracts have been developed, the outcome fund has been set up, the outcome funders are interested in scaling up, they're interested in finding evidence-backed programs that are willing to commit to this kind of funding that's backed by rigorous evidence. Thank you.
You have thrown down the gauntlet, Diane. Wow. I pity your code debaters. But before we go to Randall next, just a quick question for you, because this sounds just fabulous, and too good to be true. Yeah, I will second that. And I'm excited about digging in more. But I just want to highlight one area that, and admittedly this is not where I am an expert either, in the fundraising area, but I'll dive in. You mentioned that you in just a couple of months raised $2.6 million. If that's
in the ballpark. And the Village Enterprise website mentions that the bond right now is at $5 million. And that's a substantial amount. And yet, I might suspect that our co-debaters here might be able to leverage more. What is effectively, I'm gonna just going to say that, put that out there. Let's see it proven. But what is the evidence that development impact bonds are going to be able to reach scale? They're new. They could even be considered unproven. How do we know that the 2 Bryans out there are actually 200 Bryans or 2,000 Bryans?
So whenever you do something innovative and new that's going to completely change the way the game is played, you don't have that assurance, right? You're taking a risk. But anything great that ever has been achieved in this world, when they sent the first spaceship to go to the moon and land a man on the moon, they didn't know if they were going to be able to land the man on the moon. But we wouldn't have so many amazing technological improvements if they hadn't set out to do that. And so the way I look at it is, these are the kinds of things we need to be doing to take the sector forward. And I can guarantee, after having had meetings with multiple people that have invested in the impact bond, that there is huge opportunity for scale. And I think that organizations like USAID and DFID are already saying now that they want to fund these kinds of approaches where funding is tied to rigorous evidence. And there's already interest in the scaling up of this outcome fund, and it could scale into the hundreds of millions of dollars. If you think of how much money, how much private capital is out there, just in donor advised funds, just sitting there in donor advised funds that could be unleashed, it's tremendous. And so I think, yes, they are new, they are innovative, it's a bit of a risk, but isn't that what TechnoServe is all about, taking risks and being innovative?
I'll defer to others who are still in the room for answering that question. And thank you, Diane. We'll go on to Randall now for perspective on the corporate partnerships piece.
Thanks. Can I suggest we actually move the chairs? Because I'm not going to stand up and be quite as impressive. But I just want to have it so people can see. Because people couldn't see on that side either. So, thanks. So first of all, just briefly, I am Randall Kempner. I'm the executive director of ANDI, the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. We're a network of about 280 plus organizations that support small business entrepreneurship in emerging markets. They include groups like TechnoServe that represents the capacity development providers, Acumen Fund to be like an investor, USAID, who is one of our donor agency members, and actually AB InBev is a corporate member. And so today, I'm going to just represent the corporate perspective, but I wanted you to know that I actually, in life, real life, take more of an ecosystem approach. And so to help with that, I'm going to take off the Andy pin backwards. And you can now call me Kent Randall. I am not Randall Kempner. I'm actually Kent Randall. And I am the EVP of Business Development for Vodacom. So, wow, it's great to be with a whole bunch of the folks who care about development. Really cool. I care about it too. And I want to especially thank my new friends at TechnoServe for driving at least 3,000 new clients to my extraordinary innovation that we've been implementing in Tanzania. It's a great product. I got to work on it myself. And I just knew that it was going to create value for all kinds of customer segments. And you're right, we weren't really focused on the poorest women first, though a few of them were doing it anyway. And it's just great to see that the product that we created works so well for this segment. And it's even better, like you gave them some training. We might want to learn more about the training that you gave, because we could do that too, as long as, of course, it leads to the ultimate profitability that we're seeking. And I'm pretty confident, based on the extraordinary evidence and the cost-effectiveness study that I'm sure is coming next, that will show that we can actually be profitable using this product. And I've heard about these DIBs and SIBs and things, and I get confused with all the acronyms. really? And I've heard there've been like I don't know, like a dozen of them or something, or maybe it's 24 of them in the world. I don't know, but it's a lot less than there are companies on the Fortune 500. And I've got a business development budget of like $100 million. So, I got a couple Brians on my team as well. And they're really, really good. Really smart guys. And some Briannas as well, just to be clear. So it's really cool what you guys are doing. And I'm going to follow it, and I think it's really interesting. But as I understand it, the whole point is you have these outcomes funds, and then ultimately it works, and then you want someone else, like a government or a business or a local entity, to take these ideas and make sure they scale. So you need to have someone that actually is going to take these ideas and make sure they happen over the long term. And it could, of course, be governments, right? And often governments are funded by, or governments actually fund the development institutions that are funding these SIBs and DIBs and MIBs and PIBs and whatever. And they're out there taking these nice innovative approaches, really cool. But there's this thing about governments that you may have noticed. Sometimes the leaders of these governments change. And with those changes, so too do the focuses of their development strategies. I know it's happened, now I'm based in South Africa, of course, but I know it's happened in the United States recently. There have been some changes. There's this little thing called Brexit. I heard about that in the UK as well, and that might actually have some impact on what the development strategies are. So, I think governments have a really important role to play. I think SIBs and DIBs have a really important role to play. Together, you often fund the R&D that might demonstrate to a big corporation how valuable an intervention would be. But then at the end of the day, when you want to scale it, you got to come to us. And we're happy to do it. And I want to call out my new friend Joao. He made this point. It's not just about cost, right? It's about investment. And we can make investment opportunities. We know how to assess investment. We know that it costs some investment, which might be some training programs, in order to have the profitable impact that we want. And we're happy to make those investments if, of course, we have nice, cost-effective studies to show us that it's going to make sense. And I'll tell you what, the most important social impact I see as a business person is making sure those women and every other woman and every person who wants one gets a job. So you prove to me that I can create jobs for those folks, I'm going to be excited, and maybe you guys have just come up with a great solution for how to do that in Tanzania, and I look forward to scaling it with you and TechnoServe and anyone else who wants to hop on board.
Mr. Randall?
Yes.
Mr. Randall, that's terrific. But it would be sort of a lot cheaper for us if Vodafone would give us the administrative data that you have, disaggregated by sex. With that, we wouldn't have to do, a lot of, this study was done, but then, we can then look at your whole market, look at how women are behaving in the whole market, and then really give you right data for scaling up. Can you loan us that data? Is there some proprietary issues with it? And also, do you sex disaggregate your data?
Well, see, now you're talking about my colleague Thomasina Devasa, who runs our research department. And I have to admit, I have not spoken to Thomasina about this before. Now, clearly, because we're doing market research, though, we know a lot about our customers. We would know typically if they're male or female. And while, of course, some of that data is going to be proprietary, we have, upon occasion, with very strict legal agreements, been willing to share that data with partners. And so I would be happy to connect you to Thomasina at your convenience.
Thank you.
Great. Let's move on to Tomas, and because I'm sure we're generating lots of questions from the audience, and I do want to keep time for that.
Thank you for that. This is quite entertaining. I did not know we were going to go personal by talking to about my twin sister, Tomasina.
She's a great colleague.
She's a great colleague, but I'll take it for that. But as my colleagues have already started, I do have an admission to make. I am an economist by training. Do not take that against me. I've worked on impact evaluation. I was a lead economist at OPIC for a while, and it's not an easy job, and I admire all of you who are in the impact world. So I'm going to also take Mr. Kent's position of creating a new role for myself. My name is Tomas Debas. I work at State Department. So today what I'm going to talk about is not really a US government position, but morely a donor position. So in my case, call me Tomas Donor is my last name. And I'll go with that. So in my rebuttal to my colleagues, I'm going to outline 5 things scaling of this enterprise requires. 5 things. The first one would be reach and depth. And no entity in this side right here can talk about how donors can have a reach, both in terms of relationships, resources, and influence. So on that basis, I think the donor community is your best bet to reach the scale that you require. And the other element of that reach is also intent, right? For donors, making an impact is the cake. For these folks, it is the icing. And the calories in the cake, not really in the icing. If you're into the flashy element of things, what that would look like, I would suggest you go with them. But if you want a partner that cares, the authenticity of what you were trying to do, I think the donor community is your best bet. And I say that with all due disrespect to my colleagues here. The other thing is a scale requires systemic and behavioral change, right? And, having a Vodafone cell phone and giving them the tools that they need is a means to an end, right? And to have that kind of scale, you do need some level of policy changes in those in the economies that you're trying to do, whether it's Tanzania, Indonesia, and other markets. And donor communities have an amazing reach when it comes to policy changes because they know what policies mean to them, and also they can actually influence the host country's policy shifters. So the only thing these folks understand is profit. And so you want to ensure that you're creating the enabling environments so those things can change. Just even in the US, the type of policies that we have on education, 529 plans or 401ks, came out of a policy shift that gave the population a tax incentive for them to save. So those are the kind of policy shifters that you can make by working with donor groups because they can use their influences to do that. The other thing is scale requires essentially interoperability, something Vodafone does not know much of. And what means is that you could actually take these lessons that you've learned in Tanzania, you could take it to Kenya, you could take it to Indonesia, you could take it to Burma, whatever that might be, and donor groups have that reach again to take you to places that you did not imagine. And I'm sure that you do not suffer from poverty of imagination. What that means is that we could take you to the promised land, whatever that promised land might be for you. The other one is scale requires patience and bravery, right? I know the impact investing world talks a lot about being patient capital, but the donor community is what I call the OGs. We are the original galvanizers. We are the first patient. Before what impact investors even know who they were, we were there day zero, talking about how patient we are in terms of our contributions. And the other thing is in terms of bravery. There's a great quote from former Secretary Colin Powell that says, private capital is coward. When they sense risk, when they sense instability, they flee. So when you have private capital floating in these places, in the places that development is needed, they would flee. Donors don't. We have that patience, stamina to stick around. So you do need that for scaling. The other thing, and I'll close this by saying, scale requires collaboration. It needs partnership. And to do partnerships, you need an honest broker. I'm not sure if you would actually regard Vodafone to be an honest broker or the bond to be an honest broker. But governments inherently play an honest broker role. And we can actually collaborate, and by bringing in all these folks that are on this stage to come together for you to reach the type of scale that you need. And I say that because I do recognize and admit that both the bond and Vodafone play a critical role in this fabric we're trying to create. And I think the government and donors can actually play that coordinating role by putting them together. So on that note, please, regard us as a partner moving forward. And I'm sure you pay your taxes. That means those are the type of resources that will be coming at you. So on that note, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Donor. So, Mr. Donor, a quick follow-up question for you. We talked earlier this morning about some of the challenges of getting our government partners, our donors, to move from actual generation of evidence to evidence uptake, and having that evidence be reflected in policy making and decision making. And this is such a phenomenal project. I don't think anybody out there would want to say that it's uninteresting to them. But money is siloed, and we have funds for certain specific intervention types. If we as an organization don't reach the right group of people or the right mission with the right orientation, then we still find a challenge in getting the person who has the money available to listen to us. So how do you recommend, if your approach is really the one that brings everybody to the table, how do you recommend we overcome that initial barrier of getting the right people in the room, or the movement towards evidence uptake that can help us to galvanize the use of this work?
Indeed, that's a great question. So I would say the silos issue is a byproduct of bureaucracy, which is not only to governments, but even big corporations like Vodafone. The key element of doing that is obviously to ensure that you are talking to the right folks with the right narrative, because every organization has its own narrative and its own policy, its own drive to impact that. So I do admit that governments tend to have those silos, but it's not inherently a government issue, or donors have those issues. Even the investing community is quite fragmented. In a sense of, you have multiple funds, multiple bonds that are coming together, and they might collectively make an impact, but they might not be able to do it in a silo way. So this issue that you're raising is really not exclusively that donors would own, but my colleagues on the panel would actually also have the same kind of impact on it. But I do admit that's an issue that we need to address.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I'm tempted to probe further there, but maybe I'll allow our audience members to chime in, and there'll be more to probe on that. We have microphones going around the room. If anyone has a question here, we can start in the back. There we go. And if you have questions and you're listening on Twitter, or you're listening through the webcast but want to submit through Twitter, then that's an option as well.
Yes, hi. My name is Christopher Ying, and I work for Save the Children. Thank you so much for entertaining debate. I want to come back to the point, though, about companies and their own data and feeding that data into our own evaluations. I work on youth employment programs. I know the challenges of working with companies, not just to invest in our programs, but to provide data to help us gather evidence for those programs. And I was wondering if you had any advice in terms of approaching your colleagues in the market research departments of those companies to share their data and address those proprietary challenges.
If we could take just a couple of questions, as we've done in previous rounds. Same in the back corner, as far as I can see. There we go.
Thank you. My question is primarily for Diane. My name is Brian, and I've noticed recently that Vanguard Investments has started to offer among their index funds a social investment fund, and it seems that many of the large companies are providing these days social investment funds. And I'd like to ask you to comment on the perspective of large donors who maybe these days are now looking at maybe a large sort of market of opportunities where people claim, well, here you can invest your money and get a return and have a social impact. If you just had any general thoughts on, I'm not exactly sure where I'm going with this, but just how you see your communication with those types of individuals.
Great. Do we have a third question over here?
My name is Andrew Tremblay. I'm an independent consultant. I had a question for, is it Mr. Kent?
Mr. Randall.
Mr. Randall, oh, excuse me. So when we were going through the original slides describing this project, one of the interesting things I noticed was that the average deposits over the 58-week period and the average withdrawals are a little bit lower. So it looks like, and it's too early to really know what the long-term effects are on actual total deposits and savings over time. So there might be that women are using these to get themselves maybe through the dry months and when things are a little thinner, but it may not be that the way it's working right now is actually having long-term savings growth is a concern I would have. But they're definitely using the program because there's still a lot of deposits going in, a lot of withdrawals coming out. So my question is, if there's any tweaks that might need to happen in another 58 weeks to the program, if they're using your phones, if they're using the system, but it may not actually be having all of the intended effects, how much more would you be willing to invest in making sure that the program itself is a success and not simply business transactions are taking place?
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we'll take these three and see if we can go on to more. So lots of questions for you, Kent, on data use and program tweaking.
Yes. So I am now officially going back to being Randall Kempner. Because on the first one, I want to maybe toss both of the questions that came to me back to you. Like, I don't have best practices for convincing corporations to share their data. It's not something that I've actually personally had to do in my day job. And I hopefully I represented the challenges well, and I can see why they wouldn't. But perhaps TechnoServe has had this conversation and succeeded or not in getting success. Mm-hmm. And then just briefly on this, again, from a corporate perspective, my understanding is that Vodafone was not actually even involved in this, right, in this whole process. They sort of said yes, but they didn't fund it, they didn't do anything. And so my sense is that from a pure business perspective, it's like, sure, we'll keep going. You really bumped up our usership. I'm hopeful that most businesses are now taking more than a very narrow view of profitability, and I actually think most are. I think Vodafone and Vodacom both do. A question would be, again, back to what is the pitch to us about how to get them engaged in phase 2, given that you've already done all this work without involving us?
Yeah, that's really fair. Happy to speak to that, and because we're short on time, I'll keep it pretty succinct. But we approached Vodacom early in the process to bring them along and keep them informed of our work, and they were thrilled. Here we were promoting a product of theirs, and it took trust building, for sure. It took some iterations. It took showing them what we were doing and how we were promoting their product, the sensitivity we were bringing to the markets, the types of people we were working with, and also some substantial coordination because they were rolling out different promotional materials and we didn't want them to affect our RCT and all of this. Initially, that excitement was the extent of it. But as we built up a relationship of trust, we managed to get, and in fact, the data that you see here is backed by Vodacom data. It is backed by data that they provided to us after, again, lots of iterations of here's what we're doing, weekly meetings, and that sort of thing. And that's really the fundamental quality of, in addition to the other research that we were doing, but the support that we had from them in getting that data out was what has allowed us to have these really strong results. We're continuing to work with them as we have maybe hinted at. These results are early. We don't yet see income impacts, but we are expecting to, and we're continuing to work with them to be able to provide that. But fundamentally, it's about trust. And we do think that their excitement over our program has opened the door for them to work with us on tweaking the program or tweaking how we help women engage with Empower so that it continues to be a focus on the women's own revenue generation. But I think that we do have a bit of there is always that fine balance because of course it's a product that is revenue generating for Vodacom as well. And so we have to maintain that balance about how to ensure that the deposits and withdrawals do contain the lending that is generating profit for Empower is there, but that it's done in a way that is supportive to women's revenue growth. So again, if there's any more questions on that, but over to you, Diane, on the question on the donor space.
Brian's question.
Yes. Okay. Surprise.
Yeah. So I think our long-term vision for this project is that this could become an outcome fund that's very similar to what organizations like Vanguard are offering, but with a distinct difference. And that is that right now, when impact investors invest in a fund like the Vanguard Fund, they don't really know what that social return is, right? And they're investing in lots of different types of companies, and many of those companies really aren't having a true social return. And so for impact investors right now, it's very hard to evaluate what is that social return. And the beauty of this particular impact bond and the way we've structured it is we've tried to address one of the main criticisms of impact bonds, and that is the complexity and the cost of setting them up. And so we set this up so that it could scale beyond this initial demonstration. This is a fairly small $5 million demonstration that we believe could scale, as I mentioned, into the hundreds of millions, potentially billions of dollars if it's successful. But the difference is that the investors will know on an ongoing basis, because of the fact that it's backed by rigorous evidence, that they are having a true impact on the lives of the poor. And that means their incomes are increasing and their net assets are increasing. And that is not offered today in the financial sector. So it is a true innovation and would have a huge positive impact, I believe, on the lives of the poor, which is why we're all here today.
Okay, just do a quick add to that. So first of all, I'm a huge, as Randall Kempner, really excited about the potential of DIBs, but would say they're still untested. One of the things that is unfortunate, though, about the impact investing space is that if you dig into it today, the vast majority of the people who are making impact investing are perfectly content with a very light touch bit of evidence and not requiring the level of detail that we're talking about here. And so I am interested to see whether SIBs and DIBs can help train impact investors to care more about the level of evidence that they're seeing, or whether they won't have that impact and they will not therefore have the ability to grow in the way that I personally hope they do.
And not only train impact investors, but retrain us in the development space from the traditional donors to corporate partners about really being oriented towards that end goal of impact.
Can I respond to that? Okay. Yeah, so one of the things that I was really surprised, and that's the reason why I told that story, is I was surprised at how eager investors are. They really do want to have, those that are interested in true impact investing, they really do want to have a social return. And they want that return to be based on some evidence. So I do think there is interest. I think there are different types of investors. There are probably impact investors that are much more interested in a financial return. But that doesn't mean there isn't a whole segment of the population that right now doesn't have really an option in terms of being able to make a true impact investment that has a return. social return.
I just hope that segment's really big, and I'm not sure it is.
Well, thank you all so much. Please join me in thanking our debaters. This has been a great discussion and a great way to end a really content-rich workshop. I hope you will continue the conversation both with your colleagues and with us, and let's move this conversation to some action as well so we can see more evidence use in development. Thanks.